Amen. Tonight is one of those chapters again where you get a little bit more info when you get over into the Chronicles. Find out a little bit more of the inside scoop, the backstory. Some of it's there. I've titled this one just David Brings the Ark to Jerusalem. I have a subtitle to this message. You may, I may not. You know, I used to hear that when I was growing up. Others can, we can't. You'll get that when we get down into the kind of the substance of the passage, but I've kind of divided this up. You've got 9 different sections that I'm going to lead up and organize with just to show you a little bit. David's desire, David's direction, which is to go get the ark. He wanted to get the ark. Then David's displeasure because of what happens as they're bringing the ark. David's delay, David's delivery, and David's dancing, David's devotion, David's donations, and lastly, David's disruption. And that has to do with his dear wife. We'll read that a little bit. Under David's rule, the kingdom is now secure. It's growing, and it is being blessed by God. The entire nation has submitted themselves to the rule of David willingly and with great deliberation. Of course, that's taken some 6.5 to 7 years to do so. But David has been anointed. He has now captured Jerusalem. In our last chapter, he battled and defeated the Philistines twice and has literally run them out of the country. Again, we'll find some additional information that really helps, in fact, really helps in understanding, I think, what is the crux of this lesson and what I see and where my title comes in, you may, but I may not. And that has to do with the Philistines. They could do something, but Israel could not. Before David acted, both times, if you remember, in the fight against the Philistines, he sought the Lord's direction and he followed it precisely. I believe that pattern remains. And I think that though oftentimes we don't read some of these things, that it's intimated in this, even in the fact that David wants to get the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, is the part that he wants to seek God's will in everything that he does. Our first word, in fact, of verse 1, points us back to the gathering of chapter 5 and verse 1 there, where all of the tribes and the leaders had gathered together with David. And here again, after they had made a league with David, celebrated with David, and anointed him, says again, David gathered together all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. Now, that's kind of interesting because when you read that word all, a lot of people get confused with the word all. They think the word all, every time the word all is there, it means everybody without exception. Well, that can't be, because remember, we counted 350,000 armed men at the last gathering. Here he says 30,000. He gathered together all the chosen men. In other words, each one of these men, I believe when we look at it, they were disciplined, experienced, skilled, armed, but this was a rather elite force of specially chosen fighters. And guess who's leading them? Joab. Just reminding you of that as we go through this story. David gathers them together, and then this is where we find the added information out of 1 Chronicles when David spoke and said this. David said, let us bring again the ark. This is the same encounter, same occasion. But as he's gathering them and as they're all together, David said, let us bring again the ark of our God to us. For we inquired not at it in the days of Saul. And all the congregation said that they would do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the peoples. It makes you sound like there's more than even the 30,000 there, doesn't it? It's also interesting. I won't take the time to read all of it, but I at least threw one verse there. If you want to go back, put a little note on there, read Psalm 132. That whole psalm has to do with probably this particular occasion in which he wrote this. In verse 8 alone, he writes, "Arise, O Lord, into thy rest, thou and the ark of thy strength." This is a song that was intended to be sung as they were going to get the ark. The whole point is that I'm bringing out that he is advocating for a public change in the direction of the monarchy. And he is including himself. Let us bring back the ark. Or when we see that first verse again, or what we're going to see is we need to read and remember that Saul only sought the ark one time, apparently in all of his ministry as the king. Only one time that you'll read of it. But David was going to make this a permanent practice. He could not be without the presence of God and without the Ark of the Covenant. David had made a pledge to find a resting place for the Ark. While Saul did not see a need for the Ark, David saw how great and necessary his need was and would be throughout his rule. Can you imagine the same thing we are studying in our men's Zoom Bible study about prayer? How necessary, how needful. And even in that message of pleading that we read and studied and talked about Monday night, I cannot imagine a Christian. In fact, there's always a saying that if you go a week without prayer, or a week without prayer means you're going to have a weak Christian, different spelling. A week without prayer, meaning W-E-E-K, means you're going to have a W-E-A-K Christian. But it's that little detail of speaking with the leaders and the people kind of fills in the gap. Then we read in verse 2, David's desire again, and David arose and went with all the people that were with him from Baale of Judah to bring up from thence the ark of God, whose name is called by the name of the Lord of hosts that dwelleth between the cherubims. Now again, without going into the whole story and making this an hour-long message, because that's what it would take to get into all of the things that are here, you have to remember the Ark of the Covenant came, it was stolen by the Philistines and then came back without any help from the Philistines, other than the fact that they put the cart or the ark on a cart with some golden mice and golden hemorrhoids and sent it on its way. But you realize that it had rested in this location for 50 years. That's what some have said. 50 years. It's a long time, however long. I thought maybe 40, but some have said 50 years. And it really is an amazing thing. But the following account that we're going to read is just really a simple tale of events to see this lesson that can otherwise get lost again in the pageantry. You don't read anything there. David arose and went with all the people. That's all you read. Then look at verse 3 and 4. And they set the ark of God upon a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab that was in Gibeah. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drave the new cart. And they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was at Gibeah, accompanying the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. Now again, you don't read about it, but this is a very prestigious, huge celebration to bring the ark back. This new cart is made to carry the ark. Those identified from Abinadab and his brothers, or sons, I should say, best that we can find out, are Levites. And there's some 30,000 at least men involved. We know that for a fact. And so we read in verse 5, and David and all the house of Israel played before the Lord on all manner of instruments made of fir wood, even on harps and on psalteries and on timbrels and on cornets and on cymbals. They had amassed a band. Oftentimes, in fact, without getting again into some details, but you'll find that there was a host of singers that went with the military many of the times into battle. And in fact, the singers were in front, not behind. Now, I think a lot of them probably could have been in the military as well, because their king was one of the greatest songwriters and probably singers in Israel. He certainly was creative even in making instruments as he wrote the Psalms. Now, what a sight that this must have been, and that's what I'm trying to get to, even though our chapter is very simple in rehearsing that they went down, they got the ark, they came back, and then what you're going to read what happened. But you have to see the pageantry. You have to see that all of the house of Israel and David played before the Lord on all manner of instruments. You've got all kinds going on. And then verse 6. And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put forth his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen shook it. Well, the oxen must have stumbled. In losing their footing, they shook the ark in such a way that it looked like to Uzzah that it might come off the cart. So this man reacted in a way that probably most of us might have reacted. Now you have to think, if the ark was down there, whether it was 40 years or 50 years, that's probably as long as most of these men had ever been alive, so they'd never seen the ark moved. They'd never been around the ark being moved. So none of this looked odd. Doesn't look out of place. But Uzzah did not know, even though he should have, he did not know that he had broken the rules. He wasn't in charge. But in the very next verse, 7, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God smote him there for his error, and there he died by the ark of God. Now we'll get more into that a little bit later. Let's keep reading. And David was displeased. Kind of ended their party real quick, didn't it? They're all excited, having a great time partying along, and all of a sudden the oxen stumble, the cart probably wobbled. Uzzah just reaches over to steady it. Man, that's the whole thing. I'm not going to let that fall. Boom, he dies. David was also uninformed about his error, and in his ignorance, he was displeased. Why? Because the Lord had made a breach upon Uzzah. And he called the name of the place Perez Uzzah to this day. Now both David and Uzzah were guilty of acting in ignorance, but it cost Uzzah his life. And the confusion made David afraid and displeased, and I can kind of say, I think he was displeased with the Lord. Wouldn't you think that's what it was? When it says he was displeased, well, you can be displeased with the situation, but listen, it was the Lord who killed Uzzah. That was it. So David was afraid of all of this. And it says it, David was afraid of the Lord that day. He said, how shall the ark of the Lord come to me? His whole intent was to bring the house, or bring the ark of the covenant to the city of David, to Jerusalem, that he might give it a house. A special place of prominence, a place where he could come and seek the counsel of the Lord. So everything looks pretty good. Well, he's going to research this matter, but for now, let's read on. Verses 10 and 11 here. So David would not remove the ark of the Lord unto him into the city of David. But David carried it aside into the house of Obed, the Gittite, and the ark of the Lord continued there in the house of Obed the Gittite 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed and all his household. And then we find verse 12, it was told King David, saying, the Lord hath blessed the house of Obed and all that pertaineth unto him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed unto the city of David with gladness. Now, it's all you read. Here again is where we're going to fill in a little bit more detail. David did go get the Ark of the Covenant. But here's what's interesting when you look at verse 13. And it was so that when they that... wait a minute. We're not on a cart anymore. Now it says, and when they that bear the ark of the Lord. Just to give you that little bit. When they bear the ark of the Lord, once they had just gone 6 paces, he stopped and sacrificed oxen and fatlings. And I wonder if it was the very oxen that had driven that cart beforehand. I don't know. But we know that there was no longer a cart. And we could look at our 1 Chronicles chapter 15 to find out a little bit more. And from that particular passage, and I'll get to one verse and show you it there, but from that passage, we can find that David intended to figure out a way to bring the ark to Jerusalem. He knew that it could be moved because that's what Joshua had done. But what did he find out? It was the Levites' job. He went to the priest and he asked them to research this matter. And he discovered that Jehovah had chosen the Levites and gave them a responsibility to carry the ark and to carry it in a certain way. That's why then he gathered them together again to bring the ark of the Lord into the city of David, to a house that he had prepared for it to rest in. And so he gave an order for the Levites to sanctify themselves and then give us, or he gives us, the reason why their previous error caused so much chaos. And you read that in 1 Chronicles 15:13, when he tells them, for because ye did it not at the first, in other words, because you guys didn't carry it at the first, we put it on a cart, the Lord made a breach upon us, for we sought him not after the due order. The Ark of the Covenant was built a certain way, designed a certain way, and orders were given who to carry it and how to carry it. That's why it's that key word right there, after the due order. I've preached on this and used that message and that title exclusively. And I applied it to a New Testament church. You remember the fact that what happened to the church at Corinth when they did not properly carry out the Lord's Supper? It says some of you are sick and some of you are dead because you're abusing the Lord's Supper. They did not do it after the due order. Others may, you may not. Other people can have an open communion. Other churches can accept alien immersion because they're not churches anyway. You, my dear brethren, are not. And I am shocked at how many, it seems to me, people who were raised in Baptist churches and know better are leaving this very church and going to churches that practice open communion and accept alien immersion and even will have women baptizing. I don't know how that works. Not up to me. The ark was built with gold rings, 6 of them in fact, and had 2 long staves or poles that ran through them, and only the sanctified priests were commanded to carry the ark on their shoulders. Here's the divine instructions in Numbers 4 and 15. And when Aaron and his sons have made an end of covering the sanctuary, remember everything had to be broken down, and it had to be broken down in a particular way and put into a specific order. And all the vessels of the sanctuary, as the camp is set forward, after that, the sons of Kohath shall come to bear it, and they shall not touch any holy thing. What? Lest they die. These things are the burden of the sons of Kohath in the tabernacle of the congregation. Again, I'll remind you what David said, because you did it not after the due order. We didn't follow the commands of God. God gave clear instructions. Remember when God told Moses to build the tabernacle in the first place? He told him what materials to use. He told him how to do it. And he told him very precisely, you build it exactly as I told you to. Because it has a message. It has a meaning. Again, this man was very sincere, I'm sure, when he reached out. But nonetheless, he died. David was sincere. Uzzah was sincere. Everybody that was there singing and parading with the Ark of the Covenant was very sincere. But they were wrong. They broke the commands of God. They were intent now to obey. But David, why was he displeased with the Lord? Oh, because first of all, he found error on God's part, or he didn't understand, but I think he thought this is just wrong. But after in further inquiry, he found out the error was his. He found out the error was with the Levites and how they were carrying it. Who thought of the cart in the first place? We're not told. But we do know that it was the Philistines, if you remember, who sent the ark back on a cart led by an oxen. Maybe they thought, well, the Philistines did it, so that's how we'll do it. They may, you may not. Somebody else may do it a different way. You and I are not to be looking at Protestants of how to conduct ourselves in the Lord's work. We're not to be looking at other churches that, in fact, are not Baptist and see how they do their mission work. Oh, well, look what they're doing. Look how they conduct their church business. The Bible is very clear, and we need to be careful to follow the Lord's word. You and I have a positive command of the Lord, just as did the Israelites on moving the ark. The Philistines, of course, had no positive command because they were not the Lord's people. Just like others can do whatever they want to do because they're not the Lord's church, but you and I are. And so we're restricted. We must follow the Lord's work. So it's no wonder now that everything is going along, now that they're doing it correctly, now look at verses 14 and 15. Now he's got confidence. And so now as they're bringing it back, and as the Levites are carrying the ark on their shoulders, says David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was girded with a linen ephod. Now, pay particular attention to that too, because it'll come to play here in a little bit. He's actually dressed in the linen garb of the priest. He's not acting as a priest, but he is putting himself as a servant of the Lord. He has taken off his royal apparel. He's not naked, as Michal will accuse him of being, but that means he wasn't wearing his royal robe and his crown and everything else. He was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of a trumpet. David was praising the Lord with all of his might. I think it's possible that he also could have been playing his own instrument, singing and dancing before the Lord. As we note, he was not dressed in his royal apparel. He had humbled himself before the Lord, and this is important because notice our next verse, verse 16. And as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David. Now, as it came into the city, don't you imagine that a lot of the people heard them coming and ran out to see what was going on and joined in with the celebration? Well, there's one that's not. Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. Now, you'll read more of her opinion of what David did when she rebukes the king. But it looks like she does something in front of the household when he gets home. But it also kind of bears true, if you think about it, what Saul did in the first place when he gave Michal to David. It's like, she'll be a burr in your saddle. But you remember how much David loved her? How much he longed after her? Then he went and killed those Philistines and got their foreskins, brought them back to win her. Do you remember after he had been in exile and how that he had not been around her for years, and in fact Saul had given her to another man, and David said, I want her, you bring her, she's mine. And she came. But she didn't like him anymore. She didn't love him anymore. Verse 17, let's keep going a little bit. This is David's devotion. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in his place. Remember I told you they built a house. Remember we talked about Hiram, king of Syria, how that he had brought all this special wood, the cedar and everything for David to build a house. He didn't just build a house for himself. He built a house for the Ark of the Covenant. So they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in his place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. The burnt offering, we all know, it's one of the primary offerings. It's the offering of consecration. It's the holiest of the offerings, besides the Passover itself and the Day of Atonement. And we identify, if you remember, with the animal and confess our sins as our hands are laid upon it as it is slain. The peace offering was a thanksgiving offering, a free will offering. It acknowledges our receipt or their receipt of God's grace, and of course it included a sacrificial meal of fellowship afterwards. So that's why we read in verses 18 and 19, and as soon as David had made an end of the offering, burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. And he dealt among all the people, even among the whole multitude of Israel, as well to the women as men, to every one a cake of bread and a good piece of flesh and a flagon of wine. So all the people departed, everyone to his own house. This is David's not devotion, but donation. He was giving to everyone. He was celebrating. It's like he gave everybody a doggy bag to take home. A little bit more than just that, though. But he's acting now the part of the king. Whereas before he had identified with the priest, but did not act as one, now he identifies and acts the part of the king, and probably is dressed as one. Once this is accomplished, verse 20, then David returned to bless his household. He was blessing the people and blessing his kingdom first, and then he turned back to his house. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how glorious. Now, before I even read this, I don't think this was said like, how glorious was the king. I think this is said with sarcasm. It was said as a put down, how glorious was the king of Israel today, who uncovered himself today in the eyes of the handmaids of his servant, as one of the vain fellows shamelessly uncovereth himself. Now again, I will tell you, David didn't take off his clothes. He took off his royal garb. He dressed as a common priest. And that offended her. Why? Because her father never did any such thing. He wouldn't lower himself or humble himself as David just did. And she is doing exactly as Saul had hoped she would do in causing trouble. But watch David's response in verse 21. And David said unto Michal, it was before the Lord which chose me before thy father and before all his house to appoint me ruler over all the people, over the people of the Lord, over all Israel. Therefore will I play before the Lord. Watch. And I will yet be more vile than thus, and will be base in my own sight. He's not talking about something crude. He's talking about I was humble, and I'll act exactly that way before the Lord. And I'll act that way before the maidservants which thou hast spoken of them, and shall I be had in honor. Listen, I'm not going to lower myself like a man would normally. He says, I'm doing this before the Lord, and I will be held in honor because of that. He wasn't embarrassed or ashamed of what he had done. And he gave her reason and said that he would do it again, and he will do it again. He would appear humble before the Lord and would not hide himself in the way that he would act. He was leading his people to humble themselves before the Lord. Those who serve him should know that David will lower himself and become as a servant in front of them all, because that's what he is before God. He is a servant. And then sadly, verse 23, therefore Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child unto the day of her death. Now, you don't read anything about God closing her womb. That could have been the case. I think more likely that ended David's love for Michal. She showed herself to not be a spiritual woman. She showed herself that she was not intent on serving the Lord, and thought that he had degraded himself by serving the Lord in such a way. I think David lost his love for Michal, and this broke his heart, and it showed that Michal did not understand his love for the Lord. It showed that Michal did not have a love for the Lord, or she would have understood, and she would have been willing to humble herself right alongside David, but she didn't. That was the disruption to David and to his household. What a sad day. Even though, again, what a great day, bringing the Ark of the Covenant. But it tells you, folks, no matter how great of a day you might have, it might turn into a bad day too. Well, I pray that's been a blessing to you, an encouragement of some sort. One of the things is we have to be very careful, again,